Hello everyone, and welcome to this lecture where we're going to be getting started with Django. We finally reached the moment we've been waiting for throughout the whole course, using our Python skills and all our front-end skills, along with the Django web framework. But before we actually dive into the technical details of Django, let's learn a little more about it and its really interesting background. Django is a free and open source web framework, and being a web framework, it really allows us to solve two major problems. It allows us to map a requested URL from a user to the code that's actually meant to handle it. And then it also allows us to create that requested HTML dynamically. So using templates, which we'll learn about later on, we can actually inject calculated values or information from the database into an HTML page to show to the user. So we're going to be really connecting all the front-end stuff to the back-end stuff through this web framework. And Django is extremely popular. It's used by many sites, including things such as Pinterest, PBS, Instagram, Bitbucket, Washington Times, Mozilla, and much more. You can check out the official Django website for a whole list of example websites that operate using Django's web framework. Django was created in 2003 when the web developers at the Lawrence Journal World newspaper started using Python for their development. And the fact that it originated at a newspaper is actually really important to the culture that surrounds Django. Because the original developers were surrounded by those newspaper writers, good written documentation is a key part of Django, and we're going to be exploring documentation as we go along through this part of the course. And that also means that you have excellent references to check out on the official Django documentation pages. Django has its own excellent basic tutorial where you're basically walk through creating a basic polling web application, and I would definitely suggest that you check out that polling tutorial later on throughout this course. And also the reason it's a poll is because that also extends back to its newspaper roots. If you're on a newspaper website, you may want to poll your readers to see whether or not they agree with the topic of a story. So when encountering Django tutorials, you're going to often read that you should use what's called a virtual environment, or you'll sometimes also see it as VENV. Let's talk about what a virtual environment is, how to use it, and why it's so important to use one whenever you're working with Django for a large project. A virtual environment allows you to have a virtual installation of Python and packages on your computer. So why would you ever actually want or need this? You've already installed Python, why bother with a virtual environment? Python packages change and get updated often, and there are changes that sometimes break backwards compatibility that your web application or web project may depend on. So what do you do if you want to test out the new features of a package update, but you also don't want to break your current web application? After all, you can't just take down your website every time a package gets updated. Well, that's where a virtual environment comes in. You can create a virtual environment that contains the newer version of the package, or a virtual environment for your older version of the package. And luckily, Anaconda makes this really easy for us. A virtual environment handler is already included. So to use this virtual environment with Conda, you're going to use the following commands, and we'll walk through this in just a little bit. But the conda create command initiates the virtual environment. So we say conda create space dash dash name, and then another space, and you type in the name of your environment. So in this case, I've called my environment my env there. And then the last word there, Django, is going to say, well, what package do I want to initiate this environment with? And conda requires that. So you will say conda create dash dash name, the name of your virtual environment, and then the package that you want to start that environment with. And later on, you can specify a specific version for that package. So you can say Django, something like equals equals 1.9 or 1.8, 1.10, etc. And then you can activate that environment with activate space the name of the environment. And this all happens at the command line. Now, anything installed with pip or conda when this environment is activated will only really be installed for that environment. So that allows you to create separate versions of packages and Pythons all on one computer with the use of these virtual environments. And then you can deactivate the environment with deactivate my env or the name of the environment. And it's highly encouraged to use virtual environments for your projects to keep them self-contained and not run into issues when packages are updated. Alright, so let's jump to our command line and show you an example of actually creating a virtual environment. Okay, here I am at the Atom text editor, and before we get started by walking through a virtual environment using Conda, what I wanted to point out is that Conda itself has really good documentation on creating virtual environments or managing environments, and it's linked to in the resource notes, but let me jump to that website real quick over here and show you what it looks like. just go to conda.io/doc/using/envs for environments.html, or just Google search conda environments, should take you to this page, or just use the resource link. But this has a lot more details than what we're going to be showing here. Shows you how to create an environment, change an environment, clone an environment, remove, etc. So if you ever have any questions further than what we discuss here, you have this documentation that will walk you through all of these steps. So what we're going to be doing is creating an environment. And there's an example here, conda create -- name. They're calling their environment snowflakes, and it uses BioPython. So let's actually create a virtual environment that will create a virtual environment for Django for us. So I will come back to Atom, click plus here to open up my terminal. And then what I will do is say this, conda create -- name, and let's call this my Django env, and then I will type Django because that's the package I want to initiate my Django env or environment with. I will hit enter, and what it's going to do is download that Django package if I don't have it already, and then apply it to that virtual environment. And conda is actually pretty smart, and it will know that if you have already a similar version of Django somewhere installed on your computer, it may not need to copy it, it'll just reference it. That way you don't need to download anything, it'll just reference previous installations. I don't have Django on this computer yet, so what it will do is fetch that metadata, and let me expand this to show you what happens, and it will ask you, hey, these new packages are going to be installed, is that okay with you? And I will say no right now because I actually don't want Python 2.7, I want Python 3. So what I'm going to do is say no on proceed, and instead I will say this, conda create name, and let's say my Django env, and instead of starting it with Django, I'm going to start it with Python 3. And the reason I'm doing this is to show you an example of specifying a specific version of Python or a package. So it's a very similar process. You say conda create -- name, the name of your actual environment, and in this case, instead of a package, I will say Python, and then you say equals, and then you type in the version number you want. So for instance, I want Python 3.5. I'm going to hit enter. It will fetch that package metadata again. It will show me the new packages that will be installed. Here, I can see that I have the correct version of Python I want, 3.5. You can also do 3.6 depending on when you're actually viewing this course, if that's been added to conda. But let's stick with something 3.4 or above. So 3.4, 3.5, 3.6, those should all work fine for what we're going to be doing. I'm going to proceed on that, select Y, and then I will jump forward in time for this to all be downloaded and installed. I'll see you there. Alright, so that has finished installing, and now we actually get the instructions. So to activate this environment, we can use activate, and then the name of the environment, and then to deactivate it, once we're done using it, we can say deactivate, and that will deactivate the environment. And if we ever want to use it again, we can easily just activate it with the activate command. And if you're on a Mac or Linux computer and you're using Bash, you'll probably have to use source, so keep that in mind. Alright, now that we've set up our actual environment, it's time to activate it. A quick note, in case you forget what environments you have on your computer, you can easily list them through this command, conda info --envs, and this will list out all the environments you have. Here I just have my default Anaconda, the root environment, and then this environment I created, my Django env. And depending on what Anaconda version you initially installed, this may say Anaconda 3 instead of Anaconda 2. But let's actually activate this environment. If you're on Linux or Mac OS and you're using Bash, you will probably have to say source, activate, and then the name of the environment, Django env. Since I'm on a Windows computer right now, I don't need to specify source. So let's bring that back down to just activate my Django env. I hit enter, and it will activate the environment. And the way I can tell that the environment is activated is you should see here in parentheses my Django env. And that means that everything I do right now in regards to Python is going to only take effect on this environment. Which means if I decide to install Django in this environment, it's only going to be installed that specific version of Django for this virtual environment. In fact, let's do that now. I will say conda install Django, hit enter, and this will install the latest version of Django. And for this course, basically any version of Django that's higher than 1.8 should work just fine. So 1.8, 1.9, or at the time of this course, 1.10 should be fine. Let's say proceed Y, but I do encourage you to at least use 1.10. That way everything we do in this course matches up exactly with what's on your computer. Okay, I'm going to hop forward in time for this to finish installing and downloading. Alright, so that finished installing Django to this virtual environment. And if I want to confirm if this virtual environment is actually working correctly, I can just type in Python into this command line, and I notice that the version of Python here matches the version of the environment. If I were to say quit, and then deactivate this environment, so if I just say deactivate, notice I'm no longer in the virtual environment, so if I say Python now, I'm back to my original installation of Python, which happened to be this 2.7 version. So that's a nice little confirmation that you're in the virtual environment and you're actually doing effects on that environment. Let's say quit, and we're ready to go. Okay, so we did a lot of housekeeping stuff in this lecture, haven't actually dived into Django, but a lot of this stuff is really important and it's going to clear you of headaches later on if you don't learn how to actually use virtual environments correctly. So by this lecture, you should have a full understanding of virtual environments, at least how to create them, activate them, and deactivate them. You can always reference that link in the resources if you want more information about the environments, and you should have installed Django to your virtual environment. Coming up next, we're actually going to get started with using Django. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing creating your first Django project. In future lectures, we'll actually discuss the difference between a Django project and a Django application. But by the end of this lecture, we should be able to actually run a Django project, a little server locally, and see it in our browser. In case you haven't done so already, you'll need to install Django. You can do that either with a conda install Django, or for a normal Python distribution, pip install Django. And remember, if you're using a virtual environment, you should activate the virtual environment before running any of the commands that we actually do throughout this section of the course. So when you install Django, it's actually also going to install a command line tool called django-admin. And this command line tool is just a useful feature for us to quickly run things straight from the command line. So what we can do is create our first project. And for that, just go to your command prompt, activate your virtual environment if you haven't done so already, and then say django-admin space start project space, and then whatever you want your project to be called. In this case, we will say first_project. And then you're going to get something that looks like this. And we'll explain what all these files are in just a second. But before we do, let's actually run this code. I'm going to jump to the Atom text editor, open up a command prompt, and run through this. Alright, here I am at the Atom text editor. What I will do is open up a new terminal or command prompt, and I'm going to change directory to my desktop and actually make a new folder. So I will say mkdir, that's make directory, same for Mac or Windows users. And I'm just going to make a new folder on my desktop to contain all the Django code that we're going to be working with for this particular section of the course. If you already have a folder like that, you can just change directory into that folder. But what I will do is I will say my Django stuff. So I will make that directory, and then I will cd into my Django stuff, and there I have it. So I have that directory made, and what I will do now is just add that to Atom. So I will say File, add a project folder, go to my desktop, my Django stuff is there, select that folder, and I can see it here now. Great. So now let's actually create that first project using that django-admin command line tool. Before I do that though, I'm going to want to activate the virtual environment I created in the previous lecture. If you're not using a virtual environment, that's okay, just make sure you've installed Django. So I will say activate. Remember, if you're using Mac or Linux, you want to say source activate, and then the name of the Django environment. And that one was just called my Django env, hit enter, and now that's activated. And then what I'm going to do is call the Django command line tool. I will say django-admin, start project, and then whatever you want to call this very first project we're working on. In this case, I'll keep it simple and just say first_project. Hit enter, and this is actually going to create that first project. So what you will notice now is in this directory, I've created my first project here. And here I have the first project folder, and you should have a nested folder of the same name, and then a couple files, that init.py file, settings.py, urls.py, wsgi, and then manage.py. What we're going to do now is take a little bit of time to explain what each of these files does. And you'll notice that one of them is empty. That's okay, that's the way it should be. And what I want you to do is check out these various files as I go along back to the presentation and explain in very brief detail what all of these files actually are doing. Let's hop back to the presentation. Okay, so here are the command lines we just initiated. And after that, we should get something like this. So let's take a little bit of time to explain what's actually going on here. Let's go first through that init.py file. So that __init__.py file, that's actually just a blank Python script. And due to its special name, it lets Python know that this directory can be treated as a package. Then we have the settings.py file, and this is where we're actually going to be storing all of our project settings. Then we have the urls.py file, and this is essentially a Python script that's going to store all the URL patterns for your project. And that's basically going to relate to the different pages of your web application and how they should connect to the end user. Now keep in mind, this particular file is really going to make a lot of use of regular expressions. So before tackling this urls.py file in future lectures, make sure you review the regular expressions lecture from the Python section of this course. Then we have that wsgi.py file, and that's a Python script that acts as the web server gateway interface. And essentially what it's going to help us with is later on, when we actually want to deploy our web app to production on some online server, that file is going to help us out there. Then we have the manage.py, and that's under that top directory. And this is a Python script that we're going to be using a lot. It's going to be associated with many of the commands we use as we build our web project and web application. Okay, so now let's actually use manage.py. In your command line, what I want you to do is, after activating your virtual environment, of course, type python space manage.py space run server. So here what we can actually see what's happening is we're calling Python to run that manage.py file, and off of that py file, we actually want to specifically call that run server command. And what you're going to see is a bunch of stuff, but at the bottom, you should see something that looks like this. Your particular version of Django, the settings you're using, and then it's starting a development server at a URL. And what you will do is copy and paste that URL into your browser, and you should now see your very first web page being locally hosted on your computer. And that's a big congratulatory step because you now just ran your very first Django project. Let me walk you through all of that back at the Atom text editor. Alright, we're back at the Atom text editor, and before I run that python manage.py run server command, I want to make sure I'm in the right directory so that I can actually find it when I call it. So notice here that if I collapse that folder, it's under my Django stuff, under first project, that very first folder. So what I will do here is cd to that first project folder, and here's where I'm going to call that actual command. I will say python manage.py run server, and then hit enter and actually run this. Okay, so you'll notice I get some outputs here, and sometimes you'll actually get a warning in red coloring, but here, due to this newer version of Django, it's not such a noticeable red warning, but it will tell you that you have some unapplied migrations, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. More importantly, we see here that it's starting the development server at this particular URL. So what I want you to do is copy this, just right-click that and copy it, or just type it straight into your browser and put it into your browser. Alright, so I've jumped to my browser and I've typed in that URL, and you'll get something that looks like this. It worked. Congratulations on your first Django-powered page. So this is pretty awesome. We actually have something running locally on our computer, and it says Welcome to Django as the title. And of course, we haven't actually done any work yet, but the next step is to actually start our first application by running something that looks like this, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But a quick little message. It'll say something like, you're seeing this because you have debug is equal to true. So in our Django settings file, we actually have a debug option that we can set to true or false. And we'll talk about that later on in future lectures. And as we build our website, we'll always have it to true, but when we want to actually push something to production, we'll make sure to turn it to false. So that way if an error arises, the user doesn't have access to our debugging tools with Django. Okay. Now what I want to talk about is that migrations warning. So if I minimize this and come back to right here in Atom, we see we have 13 unapplied migrations. let's take a little bit of time to discuss what migrations actually are and how they relate to the database when you're using Django. Alright, so as we just noted, we have our very first Django-powered application or project running locally in our computer, so a big congratulations to you, pat yourself on the back. But as I mentioned, we noticed that warning about migrations, and this has to do with databases and how to connect them to Django. The question arises, what is a migration? Well, a migration allows you to move databases from one design to another, and this is also reversible, and that's why it's called a migration. Let's say you have a database and you want to edit a new field or add something like a new column. You can go ahead and migrate those changes over, and you can actually reverse that as well. So you can migrate your database. We're going to touch back on this later, especially when we actually talk about connecting Django to a database, but for now, you can ignore this warning. I know it says in that command prompt to run some sort of migrations command at the command line. Right now, we'll just back off on this and keep it in the back of our minds. So that was it as far as the basics of getting started with Django. We started our first Django project, but up next we're going to continue by creating a very simple Hello World Django application. I hope you're excited because now we're actually going to get right into the nitty-gritty of working with Django. Thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture. And welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing how to create our first Django application with a very simple view. So far, we've been able to use run server to test our installation of Django. Now let's move on to actually creating our first Django application. We'll learn about views and how to use them. Let's get some terminology straight though before we continue. A Django project is a collection of applications and configurations that when combined together is going to make up the full web application or website. That's your complete website running with Django. A lot of times people use the term web application to describe a website, so try not to get it confused with a Django application. A Django application is created to perform a particular functionality for your entire web application. So for example, you could have a registration Django application or a polling Django application, a comments Django application. So a polling app, comments app, etc. These Django apps or Django applications can then be plugged into other Django projects, so you can reuse them, or more importantly, use other people's Django applications. This process of being able to take a Django application and plug it into another Django project leads to the terminology of pluggable Django applications. Okay, let's continue on by creating a simple application with the following command. We'll go back and use that manage.py file. We're going to be using it a lot throughout the course, and we'll say python manage.py start app and then first_app. So within our Django project, we're creating a Django application. I'm going to jump to Atom to get started. Alright, here I am back at the Atom text editor, and right now I'm located under the first project directory, that top level directory. And you'll notice we also get this db.sqlite3 when we ran our server from last time. We can just let it be for now and ignore it. What we want to do is with our virtual environment activated, actually create that first simple Django application. So what I'm going to type is python manage.py, and then the keyword here is start app, and then whatever you want to call this first application. Since we're doing something really basic like a hello world type app, I'm just going to say first_app. Hit enter, and you'll notice that we now get this first app inside of our first project directory. So this is a Django application. You'll see that it looks kind of similar to what we had when we actually ran our first project, but we get some different files here. We get views, tests, models, apps, admin, and init. Let's discuss what all of these files stand for and how they all work. I'm going to jump back to the presentation now. Okay, so we created all those files with that start app command. Now let's discuss what all these files are for. Here we have another init.py file, and that's serving the exact same purpose as we discussed previously. It's just a blank Python script that, due to its special name, lets Python know that this directory can be treated as a package. Then we have the admin.py, and this is where you can register your models so that you can benefit from some Django machinery that basically creates an admin interface for you. And later on, we'll see how fantastic the built-in admin features of Django are. It's a really powerful tool, and it's all built into Django. Then we have the apps.py file, and that essentially provides a place for any application-specific configuration. Then we have the models.py, and this is going to be a place to store your application's data models. And that's where you're going to specify the entities and relationships between the data. And that will make a lot more sense when we actually begin to play with that file. Then we have the test.py file, and this is where you can store a series of functions to test out your application's code. Then we have views.py, which is where you can store a series of functions that handle requests and return responses. Then finally, we have that migrations directory or migrations folder. And this directory stores database-specific information as it relates to the models. So the views.py and the models.py are the two files you're going to be using for any given application. And the form part of that main architectural design pattern employed by Django is the model view template pattern. And you can check out the official Django documentation to see how models, views, and templates all relate to each other in a lot more detail. But before we get started with any of this, we actually need to tell Django that we just created this application. We need to let it know that first_app actually exists. So what we'll do is go back to the settings.py file of our project and add in that first app. Then once Django knows about the application's existence, we can learn the process of creating a view and mapping it to our URL to complete this entire process. Let's jump back to the Atom text editor and do all of these tasks. Okay, here I am back at Atom text editor, and what I want to do is check out this settings.py that was created when we first created our project. And again, these are the Django settings for the first project. If we scroll down, we'll see a bunch of variables. The one we're looking for is called installed apps. And here they are. We see installed apps, and it's essentially what a list is with some string application definitions. And what we need to do is add in our own application, this first_app. You can see here that Django automatically adds its own default apps like authorization, administration apps, messages, etc., static files, all of which we're going to be discussing in future lectures. But right now, let's add in as a string that application we just created, which is first_app. And then what we will do is save this. I can just do Control-S to save that, and that's saved. And with Atom, what's nice is there'll be a little blue dot here to let you know that you haven't saved it yet. To make sure all of this actually worked, we're just going to run the server again one more time and make sure we have no errors. So I will say python space manage.py and then select that run server command. Hit enter, and as long as I don't get any errors, then everything should be working fine. I can just copy and paste this into a browser. Whoops, looks like I did Control-C, which makes sense. Let's run that again, and I should right-click this. So highlight that, copy it, and I'm going to input it into a browser and make sure it's working. And you can see here that I've input it into a browser on my other screen. I'm going to drag it over real quick, and we see that everything is still working. Good. That means the first app is working fine on the installed apps, so I will do Control-C to exit out of that. The next step that we want to do is actually create a view. So now that our first application has been created, what we can do is create a simple view. And for our very first view, we're going to just send back some simple text, like a hello world. We won't concern ourselves with actually using models or templates just yet. We're going to discuss that in a future lecture. So what we will do is open up the views.py right here, and this is under our, let me minimize this. This is under our application folder. So we have views.py, and it says from django.shortcuts import render. What we need to do is add in a little bit of code here. We also need to say from django.http import http response. And then I'm going to create a function called index, and that's going to take in request. And then it's going to return HTTP response, and I'm just going to pass in a string here that says hello world. Okay, so let's discuss line by line what's actually happening here. First, we had to import HTTP response object from the django.http module. And then each view for this application is going to exist within that views.py file as its own individual function. And in this instance, we just created one view called index with that index function. And each view is also going to take in at least one argument. And for that HTTP request object, since it lives inside that Django HTTP module, by convention, we usually call this the request. But again, you could actually just call this whatever you want. This could be jelly donut as a variable. It really wouldn't matter. But by convention, we call it request. And you'll notice that regardless of what is passed into this function, it returns HTTP response and then this text, hello world. So each view must return an HTTP response object. And this very simple response object just is going to take in a string parameter representing the content of the page. So what I could also do is pass in some HTML in there, which we'll show later on. In order for us to actually see this view when we're running our server, what we have to do is map this view to the urls.py file. So I will open up here, first_project, and jump here to the urls.py and open that up. And you see here it tells you some information. It actually tells you what to do. So if you want to add an import, you say from my app import views, which is exactly what we're going to do, except in this case, it's not my app, it's first app. So I'm going to scroll down here, and you'll notice what is essentially looking like a list of function calls to URL. And I'm going to add in one more over here, and I will say, call this URL function. And this is where it's going to look a little weird because we're using some regular expressions. So you may want to review those as we go along. But we'll just say our single apostrophe there, or single quote, and then that little caret symbol, or chevron, it's also called, and then another single quote. And sometimes Atom will automatically post a double quote there, so just delete it. So that's the first argument. It's a regular expression, and we'll explain what that actually means in a second. And then we need to pass in the views.index. But what I need to do is say this. From first app import views. So what is that actually doing? It's saying, okay, from that first app folder, import this views.py. And that means here, I can say views dot, and then call that index function, which remember that index function is inside here, views.py. So that's exactly what's happening here. I'm just saying, okay, from that first app folder, grab views, and then from views, I can call index. And then I will name this. That's the third argument. I will just say name is equal to index. And remember to put in a comma here to finish off that list. So what this is doing is it's actually mapping that application's view to this URL. So I'm going to save this. Okay, with that saved, let's actually test out to see if this worked by running our server again. And then after that, in the next lecture, we're going to discuss URL mapping in a lot more detail and other ways of doing it. So I'm going to come back up here and say python manage.py run server, hit enter, and then in my browser, I'm going to jump back to this URL. I'm going to just copy this, put it in my browser, and then let's see if it worked. And you should be doing the same thing. And hopefully, if everything worked correctly for you, if I bring in my browser, you should see something that says hello world or whatever text you happen to put into that particular view. All right, so we just created our first Django application, very simple hello world, but we were able to create that application, create that view, and actually map it to the URL in the urls.py file. Okay, so coming up next, we're going to discuss a lot more about urls.py, a little more about URL mapping, and some other ways to do it that are going to be a little more efficient and a little better. Thanks everyone, and I will see you in the next lecture. And welcome back. It's time for a challenge lecture to put your new skills to the test. We've learned enough now that before we continue to learn more about URL mappings, we should challenge you to make sure you can test out your new skills. I want you to complete the following tasks. First, create a new Django project and call it something like Pro2 or Project 2. Then, create a new Django application, and you can call it App2 or Application 2, and this will go inside that new Django project. Then I want you to create an index view inside of that new Django application, and I want you to have it return this line, my second app wrapped in emphasis tags. So note that this is actual HTML code. The reason I'm asking you to do this is because I want you to explore what happens when you actually put a string of HTML code instead of just a normal string. Then I want you to link that view to the urls.py file and run your server to make sure it actually returned that new index view you created. In the next lecture, we're going to go through the steps of this challenge task. Best of luck. I know you already have all the knowledge needed to complete this task. But in case you get stuck on anything, you can refer back to the previous lectures, or you can view the upcoming solutions lecture. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. And welcome back to the solutions lecture for the Django challenge. What we're going to be doing in this lecture video is just going through the solutions to the previous challenge together. If you were able to figure it all out, then you can go ahead and just skip this lecture. But if you wanted to see the process gone through one more time, feel free to stick around as I go through it. I'm going to jump to the Atom text editor to get started. Okay, here I am at the Atom text editor. Now the first thing we needed to do was actually create a new Django project. So I'll just go ahead and put this under that same My Django Stuff folder that we had earlier. Make sure you change directory so you're matched to it. And then what I will go ahead and do is say Django-admin, whoops. And then I do the start project command. Hopefully you were able to remember that. And then whatever you want to name the project. In this case, we'll call it something like Pro2. We'll hit enter. And then we can see here that the project 2 has been created. So under my Django stuff, I have this new Pro2 folder and it's ready to go. Then the next thing I needed to do was actually create an application inside of this Pro2 project. So what I will do is change directory to be inside of Pro2. So I will say cd to Pro2. And now I should be aligned with this manage.py file. So I can call that file and then call start app and create that second app. So I will say Python manage.py, and then the command I want to call for that is start app, and then let's call this something like app2. We create it, and we can see we have app2 inside of Pro2, that project 2. Great. Then the next thing we wanted to do was actually create a view. So I click here on view, and here we say create your views here. So let's fill in the needed information. The typical view we've shown you how to do so far requires that HTTP response, and we need to actually import that. We will say from django.http import HTTP response. And then we'll go ahead and create that index view, which is going to be def to create that function, index, and then it takes in a request. And remember, this can actually be called whatever you want, but by convention it's request. And we will return that HTTP response and pass in some code. And in this case, I actually wanted you to pass in some HTML. So we'll say my second project and then close off that HTML tag, em. Now obviously you won't be passing in an entire HTML string here for most usual circumstances, but I just wanted to show you what would happen in case you wanted to test out the capabilities of Django for this views.py file. So I will save that, and then we need to link this new view to our URL. So I come over here to urls.py, scroll down, and then we have the URL patterns list. And just like we did last time, I'm going to say from, and in this case, it's going to be app2 import views, that views.py file. And then under URL patterns, I'm going to say URL, whoops, let's go ahead and tab that in. URL, using regular expression, I'm going to use, just like we did last time, the caret chevron with the $sign. And then as a second argument, let me make sure I only have one single quote there. I will say views.index. So I call index off of that. And then we'll just give that the name index, comma, to complete that. And then finally, I need to edit my settings.py file under Pro2 to let the actual project know that my app2 application actually exists. So again, we come down here until we see installed apps, and I will add in here as an argument that app2, and then I will save this. Then we can actually run our server and make sure everything worked correctly. Let's go ahead and do that. I'll just come down here and I will say Python manage.py run server. Hit enter. Let's make sure everything works out okay. Looks like we're running it here. So I'm going to copy this, put it into my browser, and hopefully we see that string, my second project. And looks like it came out well. I'm going to drag it over. And we can see here we have my second project in italics. So it's actually able to understand that that's HTML when it reports back that view. And what I want you to do is sort of get used to this workflow of creating a project and creating applications. Hopefully you feel comfortable with the few commands that we've learned so far. Alright, that's really all there is to this challenge. If you were getting stuck on anything or had any questions, feel free to post to the Q&A forums, and I'll be happy to help you out there. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to quickly cover some more URL mappings methods. So as we continue on throughout the course, we're going to be dealing with mapping URLs quite a bit. There are several ways of doing this, so I want to briefly touch upon another way. But first off, let's review what we've done in the past. Previously, we showed a very direct mapping that imported the views.py file directly into the urls.py of your project. So you're connecting your views of your application to the urls.py file of the project itself. Now what we want to do is show you the ability of using the include function that you can import from a Django module. The include function allows us to look for a match with regular expressions and link back to our application's own urls.py file. That way, each application has its own urls.py file. As a quick note, we'll have to manually add in this urls.py file because when you start your application, it doesn't automatically create one for you. Unlike when you start your project, it does create the urls.py file for the project. So what we would want to do is add the following to the project's urls.py file. We'll add that first line, which basically imports that include function, and then where it says the URL patterns list that we've worked with before, what we will do is call the URL function from before, and then add in a regular expression as a first argument. And basically what this regular expression does is it just says, okay, look at your domain name slash, and then whatever that string is in the first regular expression slash, and then call the app URLs from the include function. And this will all make a lot more sense when we actually code this out later on. But just to touch upon what I just explained, basically what this does, it's allowing us to look for any URL that has this sort of pattern, www.domainname.com/first_app, or whatever you happen to have put there in that first regular expression. In this case, I'm just calling it what the application was called, first_app/. And then if we match that pattern, what happens is the include function basically tells Django, hey, go look at the urls.py file that's inside of the first app folder, not the urls.py file that's inside of the project. And basically this might seem like a lot of work, especially for such a simple mapping, but later on we really want to try to keep our project's urls.py file clean and modular. That way we want to set the reference to the application instead of listing them all in the main urls.py file. So you can easily plug and play with your application since everything is modular now and the URLs are inside the actual application. So let's quickly walk through an example of all of this just to show how it all works. And as a quick note, we've covered everything in part 1 of Django's official tutorial. So after this lecture, you may want to go visit part 1 of that official tutorial and browse through it. You can check the resource for a direct link to part 1 of Django's official tutorial. Alright, with that said, let's jump to Atom and actually code out everything that I just explained. Okay, so here we are at Atom. The first thing we want to do is actually check out our original urls.py file from our first project and import what we need to have there. So previously we just said from first app import views, and then we called, using the URL function, a regular expression here that just said, okay, put in the views.index in case you ever get anything just to the domain name. What we will do now is add in another URL call here and put in a regular expression with an extension of this. And basically what it's going to say is something like first_app/, and then we're going to use the include function. In order to use the include function, I need to import it. And I can do from django.conf for configuration.urls import include. And then with this function, I can actually now just pass this in as a second argument, include, and then I'm going to call my first_app.urls, and it takes it in as a string. And then finally, I want to make sure I have a comma here. Okay, let's save that. And then the next thing I want to do is actually create this urls.py file inside our first application. So I will say right-click on first app, create a new file, and call it urls.py, and it's going inside that first application I made. And now what we will do is essentially create almost like a mini urls.py file. It's going to have a lot of the same functionality we just saw earlier. So again, I will say from django.conf.urls import URL, URL singular, and then I will also say from first underscore app import views. And then I will say URL patterns is equal to, and I will do another call to URL. And now I'm just going to do a very generic regular expression. So I will just say for basically anything there. And I will call views dot, and let's just go ahead and call the index view right now. Later on, we'll test to make sure everything's working by creating a new view. And then I will say name is index. And we can have a comma here, so we can have this on 3 lines. Then I will just save that. And let's make sure this actually all worked. I'm going to say Python, manage.py, and then run the server. And you have to make sure you're in the correct directory to do this. I'm under that initial first underscore project folder. I'll hit enter, run my server, and let's make sure everything worked. Okay, so we have our server running. Let's copy and paste this. I will copy that and drag it over my Chrome browser. Let me bring that into frame. Here it is. Great. So that's what we actually had before. Now what I want to check to make sure it works is say / first underscore app, and then hit enter. And you notice it's working. We still get hello world. And just to prove that this isn't a coincidence or anything, let's do something that we haven't defined. / new page. Hit enter, and you will get a 404. This page has not been found. So clearly what we've done is working. We're able to actually direct some extension of our domain into the urls.py of the application. And this is basically what we're trying to get at as an overall idea. That I can have the application itself host its own URL patterns that I can then call from the urls.project or urls.py in the first project folder. So again, here I'm going to use this include functionality and then pass in as a string my application name .urls. And this we can actually call whatever we want. So for instance, let's say something like this, my new extension. And then I will say file save this. And let's go ahead and make sure this updated. I believe it updated right now, but let me just Control C and restart it just to make sure everything worked correctly. And then let's bring back in that browser. Okay, so bringing in this browser again. Now let's go ahead and say first underscore app. Hit enter. Great, so that's not working. So now let's actually try in this new extension I just made. So I can say my new extension, hit enter, and we can see it's calling hello world. So all of these basically are calling the same thing. So the main index page, that home page of just the domain name, is calling the exact same view of the my new extension page, which we can just, for simplicity, call first app. It's always a nice idea to try to get these regular expressions to match your application name. That way it's easier to reference and you don't get lost. It won't always happen, but it's a good idea to try to make things, at least in your own mind, readable so when you come back to them later, things make sense to you. But all right, that's all I really wanted to show you for this particular lecture. And again, the main idea here is that the applications can have their own urls.py file that we can then call from the project's URL patterns list. All right, hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you at the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lecture, we'll be discussing Django templates. Templates are a key part to understanding how Django really works and interacts with your website. Later on, we will learn about how to connect templates with models so that you can display data created dynamically, taken straight from your database. However, for now, let's focus on the basics of templates and later on template tags. The template will contain the static parts of an HTML page, parts that are always the same. You can think of it almost as the scaffolding or skeleton of the page. Then there are template tags, which have their own special syntax. This syntax allows you to inject dynamic content that your Django app's views will produce, affecting the final HTML that the user sees. To get started with templates, you first need to create a templates directory, and then a subdirectory for each specific app's templates. At least by convention, that's how we're going to do it here. It goes inside of your top-level directory. So in our example, we'll have something that looks like this, the first project folder or directory. Then we'll create a new templates folder, and inside of that, we'll have a first underscore app folder or directory. The next step is to let Django know of the templates by editing the dir key inside of the templates dictionary in the settings.py file. So inside the settings.py file for the project, there's a variable called templates, and it's a dictionary. And inside that dictionary, there's a string, dir, which stands for directory, and that's what we need to edit to let Django know where the templates are. However, there's an issue with this that we have to deal with before we can actually edit that templates variable. We want our Django project to be easily transferable from one computer to another, but the dir, or directory key, is going to really require a hard-coded file path. And that means we're going to have a conundrum. We can't really hard-code a file path with our username if we want to easily share this project or application with other users. And then we have the whole issue of different operating systems. Someone using a Mac isn't going to be able to use the same file path settings as someone using a Windows computer. So the question is, how do we actually resolve this? Well, this is where the power of Python comes into play. We can use Python's OS module to dynamically generate the correct file path strings, regardless of whosever computer you're using or whatever operating system you're using. If you want to check this out, you can import OS with Python and then try out something like the following: print __file__, or print os.path.dir name and then pass in that file tag. And we're going to actually show you examples of this right when we're done with this presentation. But we're going to be using this OS module to feed the path to the dir key inside of that templates dictionary. Once we've done that, we can create an HTML file called index.html inside of the templates first app directory. Inside this HTML file, we will insert template tags along with normal HTML. And these template tags are also sometimes known as Django template variables. These template variables will allow us to inject content into the HTML directly from Django. Now, as a quick note, these template tags can be a little intimidating for beginners. And the reason for that is because they don't look exactly like HTML, and they don't look exactly like Python either. They're kind of this new pseudo mix between the two. So they're a little intimidating at first, and you may find them confusing when you're first dealing with them. But don't worry, we're going to be working with them often enough that by the end of this course, you'll feel really comfortable calling template tags. So as a quick note, don't be intimidated if you see this thing come out of nowhere, but we will have a full understanding of template tags as we progress through the course. And we'll start off slow and steady, so you can get comfortable with them in your own time. So this is now starting to really reveal the power of why we should even be using a web framework. Django will be able to inject content into the HTML, which means we can later on use Python code to inject content from a database, which we'll learn about when we learn about models of Django. In order to achieve all of this, what we will use is a new function called the render function, and place it into our original index function inside of our views.py file that we've been working with. So I know I've been talking a lot, so let's now actually jump to the Atom text editor and code through everything that we just discussed. Alright, here I am back at the Atom text editor. Now before we get started actually creating our templates, what I want to do is quickly talk again about those dynamic paths, using Python's OS module to actually generate dynamic paths so you don't have to worry about giving this file to a computer that's on another operating system. What we can do here is under First Project, open up our settings.py file. And you'll notice that actually at the top, import OS has already been imported for you. And there's a base directory. And this basically builds the paths inside of the project. And if we actually just run this file, we can explore what these file paths actually are. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to change directory to First Project. That way I'm under First Project. And then right now I will say Python settings.py. Hit enter, and we shouldn't see any output because we're not printing anything out. So we can run it. Now let's actually print stuff out and explore what it actually is. We'll start off with this file. And this is essentially just a special key indicating the settings.py file. So if I save this and run it now, I get settings.py as my file output. So that's the actual file. And now let's print out this, the os.path.absolute path to this. So I can just copy and paste this from here. Copy that, and then paste it here. Save this, and now let's run that. And here we can see it printed out my actual full file path. So here I'm under C, users, my name, desktop, my Django stuff, first project, settings.py. And this is the sort of thing we're going to be using to actually feed in file paths. So we will feed them in directly from Python instead of typing out something like this. And then finally, we can see what this base dir is. So this whole thing has been set up as a variable already, conveniently for us, so we can use it later. I'm going to save this and then actually just print out base directory. And we can see here when we print out the base directory, it prints out the directory that leads directly to the first project. So this most upper directory. With this base underscore directory variable, we can use it to conveniently call our new templates directory that we're about to create. Let's first create that directory and then show you how you can create the template directory. Under the top directory of first project, I will right click and then add in a new folder, and I will call this folder templates, all lowercase. And here I can see I have a new templates folder. Right now it's empty. And then I can use this base directory and add onto it templates. Now you may be tempted to do something like this as a simple add-on. Maybe backslash and then templates. But that's actually not going to work for many reasons. One is stuff may be treated as an escape character. And two, this isn't going to work for all operating systems. If you're on a Linux or Mac, maybe your forward slashes will go the other way, etc. So what you're going to do is use os.path.join to actually join these two. So we're going to put a comma here, and now instead of calling print, I will call os.path.join. And this will actually join these two together. And let's show you what that looks like when I say print. I'm going to save this, and then run settings.py again. And here I can see the full directory for my local machine to that templates folder. And in this case, I'm not actually going to print this, but actually save this as a new variable. And this variable is going to be called template underscore dir. So template underscore dir. So that's the template directory. Let's save that. And then we're going to edit the directory. So if we scroll down here, still in the settings.py, I'm going to go past the installed apps, go past the middleware, and here under templates, I'm going to pass in for the directories. So remember, this is just essentially a dictionary type object, and here's this key, directories. Inside of it, I will pass in that template underscore dir variable we just made, and we can put in a comment there, and then save this. All right, so here we have everything set up, ready to go, with the paths going to be concatenated correctly. Now let's move on to the next step of actually adding a template. Within our template directory, we're going to right-click, put in a new file, and we will call this file index.html. And inside of this, I will just put in my regular HTML code, and we can set this title to be something like first app, save that, and then we're actually going to put in a little bit of information here in the body. We'll put in a header and say something like, hello, this is index.html. Save that, and then we're going to show you what a template tag looks like. And to make it really obvious how it's going to work, we'll give it a name that makes it very clear. So as far as the syntax for a template tag, at least the very first one we're going to do, you have essentially two sets of these curly brackets on each side, and then the actual variable you're going to pass in. In this case, we'll call this variable insert underscore me, so that we can actually see that we're inserting stuff using Django. So I'm going to save this. Again, very simple HTML file, except what might be a little confusing is this template tag right now. And don't worry if you find it a little intimidating because it's kind of weird and new. We will see this more and more as we go throughout the course. Now what we need to do is actually connect this variable, insert me, to our actual project and our application. And the way we're going to do that is by editing the views.py file of our first underscore app. So we will come here to views.py, and here we have the index. It takes in a request, returns an HTTP response, hello world. Instead, what we're going to do now is notice we have from Django.shortcuts import render. That should already be there by default, but if you don't have it, go ahead and type that in. And now what we will do is actually edit this function. And we're going to say something like this. We'll say create a dictionary, and we will call it my underscore dictionary, or whatever you want to call it. And then here, this is the importance part, we'll have a key value pair. And in this case, we need this key to match the variable that we created over in that template tag. So in that case, it was insert me, and we'll just have it be a string and say something like, hello, I am from views.py. We will save that, and then we're going to return, and this is where we can actually use the render function. And in this case, for the render function, we're going to pass in, it takes in the request, and then it takes in as a string where you actually want to show this. So again, that first parameter is just really the template we wish to use. And then the next thing I need to add in is the actual file itself, index.html. And then here as a third argument is the context. And this is basically going to link up what we're passing in here to our index.html file. And we're actually going to change this in a little bit. We'll create a subdirectory, but I'll explain that right after we test this out to make sure it all worked. So here, whoops, that shouldn't be a string. We'll pass in that dictionary we just created. And then we will save all of this. And now let's actually make sure this all worked out, and then we'll explain it and show you why you should edit this just a little bit by actually referencing the specific application. So let's run this, make sure it all worked out, and then we're going to explain and do a little quick review. So I'm going to back out of CD, and under first project I will say python manage.py run the server. Hit enter, and it looks like our server is running, so let's just copy and paste this. And as always, I'll bring in my browser. And then bringing in my browser over here, look what we get. We say, hello, this is index.html, and then we say, hello, I am from views.py. So we have the original header that is from index.html. If we look at index.html, we would find it there. And then we see this little message, hello, I am from views.py. So this is pretty much the amazing part of what we're doing here. We are actually inserting using Django. We say, hello, I'm from views.py, and using that template tagging, I can then pass that in. Now, a quick note, what we want to do is actually separate out our templates per application. So what I should do is this. Under my templates, I'm going to create a new folder and name it after my application, first app. And then I will move index.html into first app. And that way we keep our code modular. And the next thing I have to do is come back to views.py, and here I will call first_app, and then actually call the index there. And this slash should actually go the other way. And this slash is okay to go that way because this is basically what your browser is going to be reading. So we will save that, and let's check it again, make sure everything worked, and let's go ahead and, just to make sure everything worked, change this. So say something like, now I am coming from first app index.html. Save this, and let's bring in back that browser, make sure it all worked. And I just refreshed the page, and now I see this. Now I'm coming from first app index.html. Okay, great. Looks like everything worked out, and our templates are good to go. So let's break down everything we just did real quickly, just so we get a full understanding of how the basics of templates work. I'm going to minimize this. All right, first thing we had to do was create essentially our templates directory. And inside that templates directory, you should create a directory for each application. And then inside of that is where your actual HTML files are going to go. And later on, we'll see how to incorporate things such as JavaScript and CSS. Because we've created this templates directory, we need to let settings.py know about it. And the way we did this is we took advantage of a couple things. One was the import OS and Python's operating system. And then we had the template directory. And we used Python's OS module to say os.path.join and join the space directory to that templates that we just created. And you'll always want to use os.path.join instead of something more manual. That way this code can run on any operating system. Once we've done that, we come back here to views, and we learned how to use import render, which is something we're going to be using a lot more often than just a simple HTTP response. And then with the render function, we can create a dictionary, and this dictionary is then going to have the actual content that we want to inject into that index.html. And it takes in the key, and this key is going to be the variable that we pass into that template tag. In this case, we just called it insert me to make it really obvious. And now here, I say now I'm coming from first app index, etc. And in the render, we pass in the request, pass in the actual HTML, and then for the context, we pass in this dictionary, and then it will read in the keys when it actually wants to inject stuff into this index.html file. All right, now I know that was certainly a lot and a lot of new things, but don't worry, as we continue on throughout this course, this is going to feel more and more comfortable for you. Okay, hope you enjoyed that lecture, and I will see you in the next one. Everyone, and welcome back. In this lecture, you have a challenge, and it's a Django templates challenge. Templates is a big leap forward for us, so it's a good time to quickly get some practice using them. And we're going to be using your older Pro 2 project that you created for the previous Django challenge. If you don't have that project anymore, just quickly recreate it using the creating project commands and the creating application commands that we've learned in previous lectures. Once you have that set up, you want to go ahead and complete the following tasks. Create a templates directory and connect it to the settings.py file of that new second project. Then, create a new view called help and use the URL mapping to render it for any page with the extension /help. So again, you're going to go to your second project folder, create that second new application, create a new view, so a function within that views.py file, and use the URL mapping that we've learned to actually create a rendering for any page with the extension /help. And then I want you to use template tags to return help page. So in the templates directory that you made, create a new folder, and within that folder there should be something like help.html, and then that should have template and template tags that basically returns help page. So just get everything connected so that it's clear that you understand how to use templates to connect to a view and actually inject code into the template HTML. Alright, best of luck with that, and in the next lecture we will briefly code through the solution. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you there. Everyone, and welcome back. In this lecture we'll be coding through the solutions for the Django templates challenge. Let's quickly review what we had to do. We wanted to create a templates directory and connect it to the settings.py file, so we'll tackle that first. Then we wanted to create a new view called help and use URL mapping to render it for any page with the extension /help. And then we wanted to add template tags to return something like help page. Okay, let's jump to the Atom text editor and accomplish all these tasks. Okay, here I am at the Atom text editor. To start off, let's create that templates directory. So I can just right click on Pro2, add a new folder, call it templates, and then hit enter. And then inside of this, I'm going to do a subdirectory for my application. In this case, we'll just use app2. You could have also created a new application for this, whatever made more sense to you. And let's call this app2. Again, I wouldn't have been surprised if you did something like help and created a new directory, an application called help. But for right now, we have templates and app2 created. Now let's go to our Pro2 or Project 2 settings file and sync up this templates directory to our actual settings. Remember, we use the convenient import os command to actually do this. So I will create something that looks like this. We'll say template directory, and I will say os.path.join, and I will join my base directory with templates. Great. And then I have to scroll down to my actual list, past installed apps, past middleware, and then here in templates, this list has a dictionary inside of it, and under dirs for directories, I want to just say template_dir, and then save this. Alright, great. Now let's continue on. The next thing we want to do is sync up and map the URLs. And in order to do this, we have to do a couple things. First off, I want to do what we've done in the previous mappings URLs lecture, where we actually have each application have its own urls.py file. So I will right click on app2, create a new file, and I will call it urls.py. And that goes inside app2, which is inside project 2. And then here what I will do is the following. I'll say from django-conf-urls import URL, and then I will also say from app2 import views. And we haven't actually created the help view yet, but we will in just a second. And then finally, we'll have our own URL patterns list here. And inside of this list, I'm going to call the URL function that we just imported, and then pass in something that looks like this. We'll put some regular expression here. And then I will say views dot, and in this case, we've previously done index, but I wanted to create a new view called help. Haven't done it yet, but I will. So we'll call views.help there, and we'll give it the name help. And then let's save that. And now let's go to our actual urls.py file of project 2 and connect this URLs to this URLs. So we'll scroll down, and here we have the URL patterns for the entire project. So let's connect this to our actual urls.py that's inside of our application. And in order to do this, remember we need to import the include function. So I will say from, again, django.conf.urls. And I could have actually put this up here, so there's no need to really write this twice, but I just want to make it really clear what we're doing. I'll put in include. And again, I could have just done something like comma include here. That would have been the same thing. But just to make it clear, I'm going to put it in as a new line. Save that, and then we have our index page. We have admin, but let's add in something else here. We'll say URL, and using regular expressions, I'm going to say chevron or caret, and I will say help. And then I will say include, and I will call app2.urls, comma, to finish that list, and save that. And then a couple things we have to still do is actually create that view and then create the HTML that we call for that view. So coming back to views in app2, right now I have this index view, but let's create a new one called help, and it will take in a request. And then there's something we still need to add to this, which is actual use of that render. So I'm going to make a dictionary. We'll call this help dictionary, or really whatever you want to call it. And then I create a dictionary, and we'll call this help insert. And as the value for that key, we'll just say help page, just to make it really clear. And then I'm going to return the render function, taking in that request, realizing that it goes with app2, and we'll say help.html. So what that's actually calling is over here this template that we're about to create. And then the context of this that we actually inject using the template tagging is going to be this help dictionary. Okay, save that. And then finally, last step is to actually create that HTML file. So we'll say new file, and this will be help.html. Hit enter. I'll say HTML here. Title, we'll say something like help page. And then finally, let's actually insert using template tags. So hopefully right now you realize the most basic template tags is just the double brackets, those double curly brackets on each side. And then we want to actually insert the dictionary that we created, that context. And something to keep in mind that we're not actually inserting the dictionary, but the key of that dictionary. So if we go back to our page here, under views, we want to import this help insert. So sometimes a common mistake is to accidentally put in help dictionary, but you should really be putting in this variable right here, help insert. So I will copy that and come back to help here and paste that in. All right, so that was a lot of steps. Let's hopefully make sure it all worked out. I'm going to say here under project 2, Python, manage.py, run server, hit enter. And if we did everything right, we should be able to copy this URL and paste it into our browser. Let me bring that browser over. And here we have our browser. It says my second project. That makes sense. That's the index page that we set up previously. But now let's test this out and write help. And you'll notice we get the help page. So it takes in the template tag that we inserted and it looks it up. And we can see also help page here. That's the title that we inserted here. So just to clarify, this help page up here on the top, that's from the title. This help page as HTML text is coming in from that template tagging of help_insert. All right, if you were having trouble with this, then I really suggest that you take the time to review the previous lectures on template tagging and setting that up and trying another shot at this exercise. This is definitely a big leap forward, and it's really important that you have this foundation of connecting the templates and the views together. Because coming up next, we're going to learn how to connect this to models to your actual database. All right, hope you enjoyed that little challenge, and I will see you at the next lecture. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back. In this lecture, we'll be discussing Django with static files, and we'll learn how to insert static media files. So far, we've used templates and template tagging to insert just simple text. But we don't always just want text. What about other types of media? For example, returning a user's photo. Let's go ahead and discuss static media files. We're not yet at the point where we can connect to a database, grab a user's photo, and then insert it, but we are at a point where we can just grab a static media file and serve it to whoever happens to visit the page. To do this, we're going to create a new directory inside of the project called static, just like we did for templates. Then, we're going to add this directory path to the project settings.py file. Then we will also add a static URL variable. Very similar process to what we did with templates. Once we've done all that, we need a place to store our static image files. So, underneath the static directory, we'll go ahead and make a new directory called images. And you can go ahead and place a favorite JPEG file inside this images directory, or just download one off the internet. Then to test that this all worked, once we've set it up, we should be able to go to a URL that looks like this. It'll be your domain /static/images, and you should be able to pick up whatever picture you happen to save there. And that will allow us to confirm that the paths are set up and connected properly. But what we really want to do is set up a template tag for this. So that line right there shows us that we have everything connected, but then we're going to learn how to actually inject that static media image using template tags. And to do this inside an HTML file, we need to add in a few specific tags. So at the top of that HTML file, we're going to add this load static files, which basically tells Django to load up the static files. But keep in mind, this line right here is going to go after that doc type HTML line. So that doc type HTML that's automatically created when we create an HTML file, make sure that always goes at the top, otherwise you may get errors. And we'll walk you through this when we actually code this out. Then what we're going to also do is insert the image with an HTML image source. So as you remember from the HTML lectures, when we're actually inserting an image into HTML, we use this image tag. But in this case, for the source, we're not going to provide a file path. Instead, we're going to use template tags to actually inject static and then call the part of the file path we need. In this case, it'll just be images pic.jpg, or whatever your picture happens to be called. And this will all make a lot more sense when we actually code this out. Now, a quick thing to notice is how this template tag, those curly bracket %, is a little different than the double set of curly brackets. We're going to be discussing and showing these differences more clearly in future lectures, but for right now, just consider those double curly brackets as being used for simple text injection. And we can actually use these curly bracket %, template tags for a lot more complex injections and actual logic. Later on, you'll see how we can actually write a for loop using those template tags inside our HTML file. Okay, let's code through an example of serving up a static image, and afterwards we can dive into models and databases by moving on to Django level 2. I'm going to jump to the Atom text editor to get started. Alright, so here I am at the Atom text editor. The first thing I want to do is, just like we did with templates, I'm going to create a new folder called static. So I will right-click the top level directory of first project, click new folder, or new directory, call it static, and then inside of this static I'm going to do another folder and then call it something like images. And now we have the directory first project static images, really similar to what we did for the templates first app. Let me collapse some of these things. All right, the next thing we have to do is tell Django where to actually find static images. In this case, we edit the settings.py file just like we did with templates, so really similar process here. And then, just like we did with templates, we're going to use the os.path.join, but we'll add a little more to it. In this case, we will create a new variable and call it something like static _ dir for the directory for the static, and then we will say os.path.join, and I'm going to join that base directory just like we did last time with the string static. So that leads just to this static folder here. And then later on, we can call images when we're actually dealing with our template tags. So this basically provides that absolute path to the location of that static folder inside of our project. Alright, so the next step is to scroll all the way down in your settings.py file, and you should notice something that mentions static files right here. And it also has a really nice link to the documentation on how to actually set up static files. And you see that we already have basically a pre-built variable, static URL, leading to static. And that just allows you to use that for convenience. But what we want to do is add in another variable that will actually be able to take in a list of static file directory paths. And basically the reason for this is, when you're dealing with your own applications and your own projects, for this static folder, you may not want something so simple as just static images. You may actually want to take the approach we did with templates and have each application have its own special folder, and then within that folder put in your images. So this may have been static first app images. So just to keep that in mind, let's show you how you can actually create a variable that will be the static files directory. So we'll do something like static files, all caps, _ dir_s, so static file directories is equal to, and then this is going to be a list. And here is where we're going to pass in that variable we made earlier. If we scroll all the way back to the top, or close to the top, this static directory, which is just joining the base directory of that static folder. So coming all the way back down, we will pass in here static directory. And we can put a comma there to make sure that works with the multiple lines. As a quick note, you should always check to make sure that this static files underscore dirs variable doesn't already exist. Sometimes some boilerplate code will already have it placed there for you, so you'll want to check. And it's possible that in future versions of Django, they will actually create this as an empty list to begin with when you generate a new project. So keep that in mind. You should always check to make sure you're not overwriting a variable or double defining it. Otherwise, you're going to get confused, and Django will also get confused. So let's keep on going. The next thing I want to do is to actually place some sort of JPEG file inside of this images folder. So I'm going to do that. I'll do that through just Windows Explorer, or if you're on a Mac, do that with Finder. So let me jump to doing that. Alright, so I just did that through the Finder. You weren't able to see it because I was doing it on another monitor, but as a quick little note, if I bring in my browser here, I just downloaded this picture of Django. This is the actual guitarist that Django is named after, Django Reinhardt. And then I put it into the images. So go ahead and put in whatever JPEG file you want there, and I'll just put in Django for that. Okay, let's go ahead and continue. And with everything we have now, we should be able to actually test out and run the server. Before we do, I just want to quickly review what these three variables we created are in the settings.py file. So scrolling back up here, this static directory is just using the Python OS module to actually join the base directory to static. And then scrolling all the way down to the very bottom, we have the static file variables. We have static underscore URL. And if you're using an older version of Django, make sure you manually place that in. 1.9 and above should have done this automatically for you. And you want to make sure you have the forward slashes both at the beginning and the end of that string. So definitely scroll all the way down and make sure that's already been placed for you. If not, go ahead and copy this, static underscore URL equals that string of static. And then we have the static files underscore dirs and that list. And basically what's happening is the two variables that we created, static dir and static files underscore dir, refer to locations on this computer where static files are being stored. And then that final variable that was already here, that static underscore URL, is just going to allow us to specify the URL with which static files can be accessed when we're actually running our Django server. So for example, when you're actually running the server, someone could go to your domain name /static/ and get access to static content if they're on the client side. And later on, we can add protections to make sure not everyone can just go and grab static content. But let's just test this and make sure everything's working out. I can do that just by saying Python. Actually, let's cd into first project first. And now I say Python manage.py run server, hit enter, and it looks like it's running. Like I've done before, I will just copy this and bring it in my browser. So bringing in my browser, I can see here the previous stuff we've worked on for the first project. Hello, this is index.html, and now I'm coming from first app index. But what I want to do now is actually get to that static image. So I will say this, static images / and then type in Django guitar.jpg or whatever your JPEG file happens to be named. And here we have it, the picture of Django. And now what we want to do is actually use template tagging to inject this image into an HTML file. So as a user, you're not going to be directly sifting through the static images just to find a JPEG. What we want to do is show this as if it was just a normal HTML page that happened to have this image injected into it. So let's work on doing that. So coming back to our templates page over here, we have our first app, and then we have that index HTML. So now let's call this something like Django guitar page. Save that, and then I will say, hi, this is a picture of Django himself. And then we want to actually use template tagging for the injection or inserting that actual material. So I'm going to delete this insert me. Remember that was from the previous view that we were working with earlier. And below this doc type HTML, I want to load static files. And that basically allows Django to know, hey, we need to load some static files here. And that will save you time if you don't need to load static files. That way you're not just always loading them. So we'll say load static files. Okay, and again, notice the different type of template tagging I'm using here. So as a quick note, I mentioned this in the presentation, but you always want to make sure that the very first line is this one, doc type HTML. Otherwise, the HTML code is going to get confused. Then the next thing we want to do is to actually put in an image tag that will have the picture of Django. So let's do that. We have an image, and the source we want to do is where we use the template tagging again. So typically, what we were doing in the HTML section of the course is we were actually just hard coding the path in there. But now, since we're using Django, we can actually use template tagging to essentially inject the image. So I'm going to say, okay, this is static. And then as a string, I'm going to say it's under images / and my one is called Django guitar.jpg. That's what my file is called. And then finally, I want to close that off. And you may want to have something like an alternative here. That's what ALT stands for. So in case for some reason you're not able to load that JPEG, it's always a good idea to have some sort of alternative there. So we can say like something like, uh-oh, didn't show. So that way we can see at least something to know we accidentally weren't able to link this correctly. So it's always a good idea to have an alternative there. Now let's check in back with our server and make sure this actually all worked. I'm going to grab my browser again, and I will bring it over. And notice right now my file path is at static images Django guitar.jpg. If I delete all of this and go back to my home page, that index page, hit enter, here I have the actual, view I was doing. Bring that guy back up. And here he is, just on the index page. It says, hi, this is a picture of Django himself, and we were able to actually inject that image there. So that's static file. And as another quick note, I know I've been talking a lot about injecting static images, but static files don't just have to be images. They can actually be basically any static file that's not going to change. And that includes things like CSS and JavaScript. So those can be two files that are underneath your static folder that aren't going to change. And let me show you an example of what that would actually look like. So I'm going to exit this, and under static, let's make a new folder and call it something like CSS. And I'm going to make a new file here and call it, I don't know, my style.css. And here, let's just give a quick style tag to header1. That way we know it's actually working. Which means I'm going to say something like h1 for header1. And then let's just make it obvious. We will put the color here as something like red. And then I'm going to save this. So here I have my style.css. It's inside my static folder. So static CSS, my style.css. And hopefully you can begin to get an idea of the power of templates, right? Like I mentioned earlier, they're a skeleton or scaffolding, and you're going to inject stuff. And because it's a skeleton or scaffolding, you can reuse them over and over again and just change things slightly depending on the situation. And you can call different static files into them. But right now I have that CSS. So let's go back to that index.html under templates and show you how you can actually now call template tagging to insert the static file that's not an image, but an actual CSS file. Which means back up here in the head of the HTML document, I want to make sure I've already loaded static files. And then I'm going to create a link, and it will be a style sheet with the href. In this case, I'm going to remove this string and replace it with some template tags. And I'm going to be using the %sign because I'm not just injecting simple text. And then I call static, and then pass in the string of where that CSS is actually based inside of that static folder. So underneath static directory, I have the CSS directory, and then underneath that, I want to call my style.css. And let's close off that tag and make sure it's all working. And as a quick note, this should also be wrapped as a string, which is why I wasn't looking correct earlier. Whoops. Okay, so I have a string within a string. So these little tags here, have those ready to go. Then we have static, and we have this string inside of that. Let's save this and restart our server. to make sure it's actually picking up on that style. So I'm going to bring back in that browser. And if I bring it back in, we should see that the header has now turned red. And that's the case. Hi, this is a picture of Django himself. And we're actually connecting now a static CSS file. Perfect. So we've learned a lot of the power of static files and being able to inject them with template tags. So kind of a 2-for-1 here. How to use template tags that actually perform some sort of logic or inject something that's not just simple text. And then also how to deal with static images and static files. Alright, so hopefully out of this lecture, you're really beginning to understand the sort of workflow that develops with Django. That you're creating a project, creating applications, linking views to URLs, dealing with the settings file in the way you need to, and then more than just injecting a simple static image, actually linking static using template tags into whatever HTML files you're working with. So hopefully you get an idea of the sort of workflow we're going to be developing as we move on to larger and larger projects. Alright, that is it for Django Level 1. Coming up in Django Level 2, we're going to learn about this basically third piece of the puzzle, which is models and databases. So a lot of times Django is known as an MTV framework with models, templates, and views. And so far we've only learned about templates and views. It's time to get in that third puzzle piece with models and connect everything here to an actual database. Alright, thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture.